This workshop considers adaptation, Bowen theory, and culture. The concept of adaptation and how it applies to Bowen theory, how it's an important aspect of culture, and also how it's considered in the IDI, the Intercultural Development Inventory, a tool that I use. I was born in Salt Lake City, Utah. My family are descendants of Mormon pioneers who settled in Utah and southern Idaho in the mid-1800s. When I was 9, my family moved to Idaho. We lived in a subdivision in the country where potato farms and sugar beet farms were all around us. A year later, we moved to a small town in the middle of Wisconsin. There was a state prison in the town, and the inmates made up half the population of the town. I lived there during the race riots in Chicago and Milwaukee and around the country. And then 4 years later, we moved to Fort Worth, Texas, and I was deep in Dixieland. Segregation was a reality in my high school. But while I was there, 2 black students came to the high school. The school prepared us to receive these students, a brother and a sister. The sister sat next to me in band class, and the band teacher told racial jokes and racial slurs. I reported him to the principal. But that summer we moved again to a suburb of Chicago. I lived in and around Chicago for the next 40 years. Then I moved to Dearborn, Michigan, home of Henry Ford, the Ford Motor Company, General Motors, home of tensions around unions and CEOs of corporations. Also home to the largest population of Middle Eastern people in the country. Nearly half of Dearborn's population are people from Lebanon, Palestine, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and Egypt. Arabic-speaking Muslims are nearly half the population of the city. Now I live in Arizona, cowboy country, Trump country. Navigating cultural difference has been the reality of my life and my vocation as an Episcopal priest. Sometimes the cultural differences have been big and obvious, like in Dearborn, where I was often the only white person in the coffee shop or doctor's office, the only woman not wearing a headscarf. But many times the cultural differences were more subtle, like class and social economics, gender expression, LGBTQ. As an Episcopal priest, though, these issues have been front and center in my ministry as the denomination has navigated changing times for leadership and who is in the pews. The tensions around cultural differences and the need to adapt has been in the air. It's been the air I've been breathing for 25 years of ministry. Learning how to function effectively has been required of me. It's something I'm deeply invested in. So some ideas I've considered around Bowen theory have to do with the concept of individual togetherness, differentiation of self, the concept of regression, emotional process in society, tribalism, IDI, which is the Intercultural Development Inventory, and the concept of adaptive capacity. Bowen theory has been the framework that's guided me through most of the years of my vocation. It has shaped how I think about myself and my relationships with other people. It has shaped how I think about the congregation and its mission. I often think of the mission of the church as its ability, the congregation's ability to define itself. It has informed my understanding of anxiety and systems, whether the family, the church, society, myself. About 6 years ago, I embarked on a journey to increase my capacity for building effective intercultural partnerships. I did this in preparation to help my congregation at that time learn how to partner with an Arabic-speaking Christian congregation. I wanted us to learn how to do this graciously, generously. I wanted my congregation to become clear about itself and who it is, while enabling the Arabic congregation to also maintain its identity. The goal was not to assimilate and merge, but to support one another in our difference and value our differences. I knew this would be difficult at times, that there would be some anxiety that would come to the surface, that would reveal some of the racism that resides in the system. It's an old residue of being white and wealthy in Dearborn. But that journey for me began learning about the IDI, the Intercultural Development Inventory. It also included other opportunities to learn about effective intercultural leadership skills, all of which I've utilized. So level of adaptiveness roughly correlates with the level of chronic anxiety. Given sufficiently adverse circumstances, anyone can experience periods of heightened chronic anxiety, but poorly adapted people tend to have more chronic anxiety than those who are more adaptive. This is because the least adaptive people tend to lean heavily on others for their emotional well-being, and this comes from Michael Kerr in 1992. Anxiety that can be observed in families is also observable in society at large. In her book, The 8 Concepts, these are the Murray Bowen 8 Concepts of Bowen Theory, Roberta Gilbert writes, "What is at the base of anxiety and ensuing societal regression in human societies?" She lists a number of them, but it says that one of the primary ones is diverse cultures trying to live together. When the anxiety in a system increases, people tend to do more what they've always done, increase their togetherness with all its patterns and postures. This is also from the 8 Concepts. Stephanie Ferrara has written a lot about tribalism, and in her article on tribalism, she writes that tribalism is defined as attachment and loyalty to one's own group. It's a fundamental feature of human group living, rooted in biology, shared with other species, yet evolved in ways that are uniquely human. Considering the balance of individuality and togetherness and the correlating concept of differentiation of self, Bowen theory describes the process that leads to a wide spectrum of outcomes as it applies to tribalism and the process of social change. The commonly held belief about tribalism is that it is a feature of more primitive societies, a thing of the past. Today's large, complex modern societies have moved beyond tribalism. Not so, according to journalist and foreign correspondent Roger Cohen. The main forces in the world today, he writes, are the modernizing, barrier-breaking sweep of globalization and the tribal reaction to it, which lies in the assertion of religious, national, linguistic, racial, ethnic identity against the unifying technological tide. There's also the concept of connection and fragmentation. These two vie against each other. The internet opens up worlds and minds, but also offers opinion to reinforce every prejudice. The online world doesn't dissolve tribes, it gives them global reach, he writes. Literature in the evolutionary biology and related sciences describes the evolution of tribalism. There are 6 key dimensions. There's the affinity with one's own kind and fear of strangers. There's the brain's rapid response to threat. There are these unifying forces of common interests, along with a unifying force of an outside threat. There's a sacrifice of individual interests for group interests. There's the flexibility of boundaries. Who, us and them, have flexible boundaries, and this double standard of morality. So the affinity with one's kind, some will say, is evolutionary and adaptive. It shows up in infants when they have this stranger anxiety. It shows up also as an independently adaptive process or a xenophobic response. There's the brain response to danger, and there's unifying forces around an external enemy. E.O. Wilson writes, "Increases in real and imagined threats congeal the sense of group identity. We come together around real or imagined threats. Xenophobia becomes a political virtue. The treatment of nonconformists within the group becomes harsher." This is how we act when we are trying to pull this togetherness together feature around something that we perceive as a threat. But there's also the concept of flexible boundaries, Wilson continues to say. Individuals belong simultaneously to many in-groups, some more important to their identity than others, and people are quite inventive in creating new ones according to the needs and interests of the moment. E.O. Wilson addresses the flexibility of group boundaries. Human beings are consistent in their codes of honor, but endlessly fickle with reference to whom the code applies. The genius of human sociality is, in fact, the ease with which alliances are formed, broken, and reconstituted. The important distinction is, as it appears to have been since the Ice Age, between the in-group and the out-group, but the precise location of the dividing line is shifting back and forth with ease. Science writer David Barabee describes the emotional climate of usness, the desirable state. We like the we feeling, the sense of being among one's own kind, ease and fellowship, common values, a circle of trust with confidence in others. He states, all human beings everywhere will go to a great deal of trouble to get and keep this feeling of we-ness. Themness, in contrast, is the sense that some people are not fully human and not to be trusted. Perceptions of themness, Barabee suggests, are an emotional license for cruelty and murder. So regression is easier to see in society than the family because it manifests in these extremes of violence, chaos, or the conquest and oppression of a population. War, genocide, and slavery are all a significant part of human history, and oppression of a population. And it continues even into the present. Journalist Chris Hedges, who's covered many wars, describes the breakdown of human relationships as people are caught up in an anxiety-driven, nationalistic state of emotion. War makes the world understandable. There's a black and white tableau of them and us. It suspends thought, especially self-critical thought. We no longer think about our own actions. We bow before the supreme effort. We are one. And tragically, war is sometimes the most powerful way in which human societies strive to achieve meaning. War throws us into a frenzy in which all of human life, including our own, seems secondary. The concept of structural violence is something that Karen Armstrong has written about. She says it began when humans became more agrarian. They created settlements, carved out territories, shifted from hunter-gatherers, and really started to create a society where they were accumulating. And as they were accumulating and living in these small groups, they were trying to create their own enrichment. There was a monopoly of violence and a tendency to want to dominate other populations. Structural violence became woven into our social systems through institutions and ideologies that support the control of resources and privilege for some at the expense of others. The violence may be overt, as described by Hedges. It may also take the covert forms, discriminatory policies and practices that target certain individuals and groups, the barriers to equal access embedded in political and economic structures such as elections, finance, education, housing, law enforcement, and the law itself. In these ways, structural violence becomes part of the social norm and lifestyle to which people adapt, into which the next generation is born. Without using the term structural violence, Bowen saw the process that creates it in family and social emotional systems. With increasing tension, the mechanisms of dominant adaptive reciprocal functioning, triangling, projection process, emotional cutoff operate in combination to produce insider-outsider polarities and a host of isms that divide us and fuel chronic anxiety. So Bowen often asks if regression can be reversed, and Bowen theory often considers that regression that happens in societies, happens in families, happens in people, can be a process of simultaneous regression and progression in an effort to create a more just and equitable society, to reduce racism, genderism, sexism, etc. We, as a society in this country, have made some progress, while at the same time it's increased anxiety and deepened regression. The changes have in part been primarily policy changes, but over time it may be that the changes become more relational, they become deeper, they make more of an impact. And this is so, we may be experiencing a time of increased progression and less regression, but we'll see if that's actually what happens. Anthropologist Elizabeth Cashton has discerned a more complex picture. She writes, "It's often supposed that ethnocentrism and xenophobia are opposite sides of the same coin, but a few voices have cautioned that this need not be the case. Analyzing data from 186 societies, she found no support for the proposition that out-group hostility is an inevitable product of an in-group loyalty. And moreover, since reciprocal relationships between groups are frequently adaptive, it would be foolish to assume an attitude of hostility. In between group relations, the threshold for cooperation may be higher, and the insistence on reciprocity may be greater, but a smart opportunist keeps his options open." So in tribalism, Stephanie Farrar continues, "A society at the calmer end of the continuum is a strikingly different organism. Togetherness is balanced with individuality, and this concept of individuality is not individualism, which is about rights, but individuality is about thinking for oneself, defining oneself through values and beliefs, and being less changeable by the tides of the currents and tides of society. So togetherness is balanced with individuality. There's a good balance between the togetherness and individuality features, giving group members more room to think for themselves, to see the complexity of the issue, rather than black and white polarities, and to define positions rather than reacting automatically to group pressures. The strength and cohesion of the group lies in its higher level of individuality, its flexibility in accommodating differences." Again, consistent with Cashton, within group flexibility and openness to mutually beneficial exchanges is a predictor for between-group cooperation and collaboration. Admittedly, this describes an ideal that is not easily or often achieved. However, the ability to envision such a society gives us a better chance of realizing it. And so we often wonder if the same principles that help a family pull out of regression can apply to society. And in Bowen theory, the understanding is that yes, the same principles can be applied to society, and it really requires the ability for individuals to take a clear principled stand, a non-anxious stand, and begin to pull, or less anxious stands, and pull people out of the togetherness fusion that's increasing the conflict. So again, the togetherness individuality force is a really critical index of the functioning of the emotional system. It operates largely as a friendly team, primarily out of sight. We're not always aware of this reciprocal process of togetherness and individuality. Any emotional system has a certain amount of togetherness and a reciprocal amount of individuality, and that creates the norm for the group. The optimum would be 50-50, but it's usually not a 50-50-50 balance. As anxiety in the system rises, there will be an increased pull towards togetherness, and that relieves the anxiety for a length of time, but eventually there's going to be a counterbalancing force towards individuality as people try and see differences and make a more clearly defined stance. So togetherness forces are derived from the universal need for love, approval, emotional closeness, and agreement. Individuality force is derived from the drive to be a productive, autonomous individual, defined by self rather than the dictates of the group. The two forces exactly balance each other. The balance between the two forces has everything to do with the emotional functioning, cohesiveness, and stability of the family and the society. One definition of adaptation in Bowen theory is that it is the ability to respond to life challenges without participating in escalation of chronic anxiety in a relationship system. The capacity to adapt parallels a person's capacity for an integrated response.
How do you see people with cultural backgrounds different than your own? Do you compare them to your own? Do you notice patterns of difference and want to learn more? Do you find yourself trying to see what is similar between your culture and others? The IDI describes how you experience cultural differences on a continuum, ranging from viewing culture through a more monocultural lens, where differences may be unrecognized or oversimplified, to an intercultural lens, where you have the capacity to engage with commonalities and differences through multiple perspectives. This is the Intercultural Development Continuum, or IDC. The IDC describes how individuals and groups experience cultural differences and commonalities, and identifies developmental growth opportunities based on results from the Intercultural Development Inventory, or IDI. Adapted from the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity, the IDC is made up of 5 orientations: denial, polarization, minimization, acceptance, and adaptation. The orientations build on each other, and our capacity to effectively shift perspectives and behaviors around cultural differences and commonalities increases as we move along the continuum. Let's take a closer look at each orientation. An orientation within denial means we're missing or avoiding cultural differences. Our opportunity is to start noticing the breadth and depth of culture, from food and clothing to values, behaviors, and expectations. When cultural differences are noticed, we move into polarization, where there can be judgment about these differences. This can take the form of defense, where we are overly critical of other cultural groups, or reversal, where we are overly critical of our own cultural group. We can shift from polarization by beginning to notice commonalities between us and the other cultures around us. When we focus on what we have in common, we move into minimization, where we tend to overemphasize commonalities across cultures and dismiss the significance of cultural differences. To continue our intercultural development, we need to build our understanding of how our own culture impacts us, and also how we perceive cultural differences that don't fit our assumptions and expectations. With deeper cultural self and other awareness, we move into acceptance. Within an acceptance orientation, we are aware of complex cultural differences and similarities, but are often unsure how we can bridge differences. With intention, reflection, and practice, we progress into adaptation. Here, we're more likely to be able to shift our perspective and behavior to bridge cultural differences more effectively. The IDI uses a culture general framework, which means the assessment doesn't focus on specific cultural characteristics and can be applied to all cultural groups. The IDC is a goal-directed developmental model for identifying intercultural growth opportunities based on your IDI results. This allows individuals and groups to focus on increasing their intercultural competence through conversations and actions directed toward growth and development rather than judgment and resistance. Through the IDI and the 5 orientations of the IDC, individuals and groups will understand the kinds of challenges they may face and opportunities available for achieving their goals based on their current orientation.
So I've used the IDI, the Intercultural Development Inventory, and its corollary, the Intercultural Development Continuum, many, many times and found it an incredibly useful tool in helping myself and others understand our capacity to adapt and to notice and adapt to cultural differences, which is a really important thing to be able to do. Adaptation into cultural differences doesn't mean I change myself necessarily, but that I'm clear about who I am, and I'm also able to be comfortable with people who are different than me so they can be who they are. I think that the IDI offers really important data. It also gives us the understanding that most people tend to, as human beings, overestimate our ability to notice these differences and to adapt effectively. And so we presume we can be more effective in these intercultural relationships than we actually are. Most people fall into the state of minimization, and so we really emphasize similarities and we minimize differences, which can be, looking at Bowen theory, that's an important component. We want to have that comfort in similarity and being together. That's an important feature for us as human beings, and yet it's also important to see and value the differences because that makes life richer. It enables a person to feel like they are really being valued for who they are when we can also see the differences. Differentiation of self is an aspect of this, I believe, because it enables a person to be clearly defined who they are and also stay in relationship with others who are different without having to change them. This adaptation does not need others to affirm oneself, nor to change others in order to feel comfortable with oneself. So I find the IDI a useful tool to give some insight, some data, and insight into where one is developmentally and one's ability to do this. It's not necessarily a direct corollary with differentiation of self, however, but it's an interesting tool to think about. So there are cultural forces are important in how a society functions, but they're also insufficient to explain the ebb and flow and how well societies adapt to the changes and challenges they face. Social interactions are now known to have a profound effect on our neural, so how our brain works, our endocrine, our hormones, and our immune systems as they respond to incoming signals from the social environment and trigger physiological and behavioral responses. Throughout the course of an individual's life, social regulation is a central feature in adapting. Individuals differ in how well they self-regulate in a relationship system. And I think the IDI and Bowen theory give us insight into what it means to self-regulate, what it means to be in a relationship system, and where we are developmentally in our capacity to actually do that effectively, if that's a goal of ours. We live in a world in which different cultures influence one another. In many aspects of work and life, people are expected to work harmoniously together. Even people who travel extensively, are culturally informed, and have lived abroad struggle to be effective intercultural partners. Cultural differences don't require living in a different country, however. Many cultural differences are present with us in our neighborhoods, cities, and the various organizations we function in. The effort to respond to and be in relationship with people who are different from oneself produces anxiety. It's a natural state to have anxiety rise up in us as we encounter differences. Yet the reality is that working and living in diverse communities and learning to value cultural differences increases creativity and the available assets in oneself and in the community. Learning how to widen and adapt one's comfort across multiple dimensions is an expectation for many professions. Certainly has been one of mine. So Bowen theory, the Intercultural Development Inventory and Culture, some of the key concepts: differentiation of self, how to define oneself, one's principles and beliefs, while staying actively engaged in family, community, society, other relationships. Considering the concept of tribal biases and insight that one might gain from the IDI, Intercultural Development Inventory, and where one is on that continuum is useful. Understanding how one is formed and informed and views the world from one's own culture, that's a key skill, learning how to understand how one is, this is about bias, how one is shaped and formed by one's own lifestyle, one's own culture. There's also a projection process that comes into play that we project onto others, and we don't always see what part each of us are playing in that reciprocal process. Cutoff is a big part of it when we start to define people as us and them. But what's important, the idea I will say, is that it's the differences that make a difference. Being able to value those differences is important. Lori Lassiter writes about triangles in culture, and she sees that there's an option. So triangulation is a key concept in Bowen theory, and it has to do with whenever there are two people who are in a relationship and there's tension, they will bring a third person in to offload some of the tension onto that third person. We might call it gossiping. There's different language for it. But there's also a way in which Lassiter says that by creating a triangle, a person can intentionally put themselves in the outside position as an effort to look at the system, at the triangle, with a little bit more neutrality. And so you can be less reactive to what's going on, and you can begin to have some sense of understanding and impact the triangle in a more effective way. So she calls this differentiation of self, refers to the degree of freedom from governance by an automatic use by the larger whole. It is characterized by the degree of an individual's capacity to manage or regulate its relationship to the large unit of which it is a part. There's probably not a direct correlation between the stages of development along the intercultural development continuum and a scale of differentiation, so the IDI and Bowen theory, but I have found that one informs the other and vice versa, and it's provided me with deeper insight and self-awareness. In this effort, I've considered the capacity to adapt as a dimension of each, the IDI and Bowen theory, and as a characteristic of human behavior as we learn to manage ourselves when we encounter the discomfort of differences between oneself and others. So some things I've learned: 64% of people globally who take the IDI are in the developmental stage of minimization. This stage emphasizes similarities and minimizes differences. Of the people who have taken the IDI at my invitation, 90% are in this developmental stage of minimization. This includes people who studied Bowen theory for a long time, religious people. In the world that I move in, a lot of people in the stage of minimization. We really value similarities and we struggle with differences. So my question is, as I continue to think about this, is the IDI a useful tool for people studying Bowen theory? I think it is. Does it offer any helpful insight into oneself as one thinks about theory and differentiation of self? And are there any other more useful questions to consider regarding adaptive capacity, Bowen theory, and the IDI?